you find yourself struggling on the latest TFT patch 13.5, don't worry, you're not alone. A lot of players and streamers are finding it difficult to be consistent because it feels like a lot of compositions are not that powerful. There's not a clear S tier, and yet, for some reason, whenever you play something, you're still going bot 4. But don't worry, TFT Academy has got you. Soap is still rank 1, climbing a bunch of LP on this patch, and I've been following all the top tournaments and watching the secret pro scrims, so I can keep you guys updated on the latest trends. So let's go ahead and dive into the TFT Academy tier list and find out what's up. Before we start, I want to give you the 1-2 on my guide on how to climb this patch. Right now on 13.5, I actually think that the first thing you should be thinking about every game is, can I reroll? If you can reroll, you're going to be preserving so many placements because at the moment, lobby tempo is very, very high. Everyone's going to be taking really, really powerful augments like Starry Night, or they're going to be taking things like Too Much Value, and that's going to be a ton of econ that's going to give them free rerolls and hit things like 2 stars very quickly. A very common scenario that you might find yourself is that if you take something like a lose streak augment and you're playing for, let's say, Enforcers or Sorcerers, you're going to lose stage 2, and then you're going to realize that by stage 3, you're going to be still too weak to actually keep up with all the reroll players. And so you end up losing 10 fights in a row, and then you get to level 8 and stage 4, and you roll, and you don't hit your 2-star 4 cost. That's how you bleed out. That's how you bot 4, and that's why you end up blaming Mordog and asking him in chat if he can balance his game finally. So look for a reroll composition. There's currently 6 reroll compositions that we're going to talk about that actually are pretty solid, and you actually have the ability to play them pretty much every game. And then there's also a couple of other bonus rerolls. So for example, if you're playing Sorcerers, you can play Swain 3 with Nami if you hit something like Rig Shop, or you could even play some of these C tier augments, which aren't exactly the best reroll compositions, but they do offer you top 4 placements if you play them from ahead. Family, if you have a specific augment for it, which we'll talk about later. Kog'Maw and Cassio, these are all top 4-able comps that can get you those placements. And surely amongst all these 10 reroll comps, you're not going to be contested if you pick the right line. So make sure you scout. Game plan number 2 is if you are high rolling, you then go for a 4 cost. A lot of times what you'll end up doing is you'll slam items for reroll, or you'll be looking to try to play a reroll composition. And if you see something that's really high roll for the 4 cost line, then you can consider playing it. One common scenario that you might encounter is you slam items for something like a Renata reroll, which is AP Visionaries, and then you realize that other people are playing Renata reroll or contesting you, or perhaps even another Sentinel player is taking your front line. You hit an early Heimerdinger and you have good items for it. You can maybe deviate into one of these lines and play for a 4 cost, but you only do that if you are ahead and you have a lot of HP and gold, because it is very expensive to actually make it happen. If you end up following these 2 steps, you're going to minimize the number of stuns and ace, which will raise your average placement dramatically, and that'll be one of the keys to climb on a patch like this. Just make sure that your items and your augments always make sense, and then finally, your anomaly also is a good choice. And if you ever need questions on what the good anomaly is, just always go ahead and click this evolve button and take a look at what we recommend here on TFT Academy. All right, so we have our game plans. Go ahead and dive into the tier list and find out what comps are on top. Let's start off with the most popular comp and considered by many to be the most powerful composition in the game, Sorcerers. Sorcerers got buffed in a few different ways. The primary way is that now they are much more flexible because they buffed a bunch of other frontline packages for it. The number one problem with Sorcerers in the previous patch was that the frontline was very questionable, especially back when we played 8 Sorcerers. But now that you only need 6 Sorcerer in order to reach the peak power of getting the damage reduction, now all you have to do is really slot in some 4 costs that are pretty good. They buffed Emissaries by giving it more HP, and that's really impactful because more HP for Emissaries means more HP for Garen's buffs on Vlad and Elise or whoever else you put in the front line. In my opinion, I think this is the default version that you can play that's really safe, but you have to make sure you have Garen items. Garen items are not things like Stoneplate and Crown Guard and Vow. If you do have that, then you're probably going to play the Sorcerer variation that plays 6 Sorcerer, and then you flex in other traits like Form Swapper, Bruisers, or Rebels. But if you do have a ton of belts and you're slamming things like Sunfire and Warmogs early, definitely think about Garen. Collect those emissaries on the roll down and play it pretty straightforward. 4 Sorcerer, 4 Emissary on level 8. Push it level 9 and then flex on whatever else you can get. Swain is going to be the primary carry that you play around because he is just way more reliable than Zoe and Nami. Nami only hits 3 targets and she's not as consistent as Swain in terms of DPS. Swain just deals more damage. And then also Swain and LeBlanc can target backline together. You want to put them on the same side. Let's say the Scion is the enemy carry, for example. If LeBlanc and Swain target it, the Swain's crows will shoot past the Scion. LeBlanc's chandelier chains everybody in the back, and it does a bunch of AoE and wipes them out. So it's much more effective. You could play Zoe, but if you do play Zoe in Emissaries, you'll just realize that it gets very awkward because you don't have enough front line. Instead, if you do want to play around Zoe, consider playing the 6 Sorcerer variation, and you just flex your front line, and you can have Swain and Zoe duo until you hit LeBlanc. Zoe can hold LeBlanc items totally fine. The nice thing about LeBlanc is that she can hold a bunch of extra leftover items. She can hold like Static Shiv, Red Buff, Morello, Rage Blade, and then you could also just put like Jewel Gauntlet and Guardbreaker on her just fine. Just to go back to what we were saying before, you don't have to play 4 Form Swapper. This is just the best way to buff Elise and Swain, who are going to be your tank and carry in this variation. But you can also play things like more Black Rose. You can play like 5 Black Rose. You can play Mordekaiser. You can play some 6 cost. You can even play some Rebels. They did buff Rebels, so Set is a bruiser for Elise, and you could always play Alawi and Irelia for Sentinel, for example. You can also mix and match as well. So let's say you are not finding Nami, but you hit Garen. You play Garen. Garen's a Watcher, and then instead of Nami, you play Zyra, and that's how you have 6 Sorcerer. Take out the Nami for the Emissary. Don't feel like you have to be playing that always, especially if you're not hitting. In general, Sorcerer's a win streak composition, so slam your items aggressively. Shojin, Jewel Gauntlet is a pretty classic combination, but you could also slam Rage Blade and Death Cap. You could slam Sunfire and Spark. You can just do a bunch of different things. Just make sure that you win as many fights as you can. Aim for items and econ early, so things like high voltage, raining gold, quality over quantity. These are really strong like tempo, econ augments that really synergize with items or just having a lot of gold. And then in the late stage of the game, make sure you have a good combat augment like Mana Flow, Blazing Soul are some of the best. Glass Cannon also got buffed again, so you can definitely take something like that and back roll all your sorcerers and watch your enemies blow up. In terms of the max cap, always keep in mind that Sorcerer Emblem on Mel is disgusting. If you find a blue buff Sorcerer Mel, she ends up being your primary carry. So don't sleep on Mel if you ever get a chance to have that Sorcerer Emblem. And the last thing I want to say is that I do think Sorcerer Crest and Crown can be worth taking, but it's surprisingly kind of mid because you are sacrificing entire augment for it. So if you're in a spot where you get offered a Sorcerer Crest versus, say, like Mana Flow, I think you should be taking Mana Flow instead. Because the +1 sorcerer, you can just get away with not playing that by going for the emissary version. And now you have mana flow. So just keep in mind that it's not always about the sorcerer +1, even though 6 sorcerer does give you a pretty dang good effect by reducing the damage. Visionaries did get nerfed, but they are still extremely strong. I think last patch they were probably just overtuned. And now this patch, once more, we have Visionaries on top alongside sorcerer. It's an AP meta. Renata reroll is going to be extremely common in all of your lobbies. If you don't see a Renata player and you have any kind of semblance of AP items like in Archangels, you have Rel and Renata, you should definitely consider playing a reroll Renata strategy. There's 2 ways to approach this composition. The first is to approach it like a traditional lose streak reroll composition and try to spike on stage 3. All in stage 4, you're going to be losing, collecting your econ, preferably doing stuff like Starry Night and Prismatic Ticket or whatever, racking up your free rerolls and getting up for a huge 3-2 roll down to stabilize. You're always going to be playing 6 Visionaries in late stage game because this ability is really important. The other variation is to play a Chem Baron loose streak, where instead of, say, Irelia and Alawi, and maybe not emphasizing Vex with items, you play a Rennie, and you go for Rennie, Singed, and Renata, and you use Rennie as a tank, and then maybe you splash in Sets, for example, instead of like Irelia or Alawi. And then you play Nunu as a Bruiser Visionary, and then maybe Nunu ties into Sets, and that's how you get Rebels. We actually have a variation of that, and this is a little bit of a spoiler coming up next, but we have a Chem Baron Visionary reroll that kind of plays around Rennie and backline Heimer and Malzahar. And so it's very similar to that, where basically you use Rennie and your other Chem Barons as a cash out mechanic to get items for your front line, and maybe extra copies of Renata. Other augments that might just be a signal for playing Renata investment strategy is Insane. It's just really, really powerful. Or if you get like these insane combat augments, Power Shields, or Mana Flow, could be ridiculous for a Renata composition. A couple of optimizations we figured out. One, your first vest is always going to want to be Stoneplate Gargoyle because just the way you position is going to favor that, especially on Rel. Rel really wants that. She has a shield already with her abilities, so Stoneplate ends up being really good on her. And your first tier generally wants to be on Archangel Staff. on Renata. Sometimes you just have to slam Shojin because you can't get the rod. But if you do get a priority of item choices, try to go for Archangels first. Leftover AP either on Vex, Morg, or Malzahar, and then yeah, just like basically sit back and watch Renata shield everything infinitely and kill everyone 8-0. The one thing I like about this composition is that it really stat checks people. If you're stuck on 1-star 4 cost, you are not killing very much on this board. So yeah, make sure you stabilize through a Renata 2 Rel 2, get that 3-star, and just push for the win. All right, we previewed it in the previous section, and we might as well just like follow it up with it. But this is the tempo variation of Visionaries, where you play for 6 Visionaries, play around Heimerdinger and Malzahar. If you do end up getting a Visionary Emblem, this is what you think about. Because Visionary Emblem is actually good for Renata, because you can get Visionary on 6 costs, you can play Visionary on Rumble. Those are all really good. But you have way more flexibility with 6 Visionaries. Very similar to Sorcerers, actually, because you could justify playing an Academy package. We have an Academy shown with like Leona, Jace, and the Heimerdinger. That's like the way you can play Academy if you have a good Academy item. Let's say like it's an Archangels or an Infinity Edge. But you could also like take out this Academy package and play for Rumble. You could play for Mel. You could play for other variations that might be pretty flexible as well, like maybe Nunu and Experiment if you hit like a Warwick. You could also play around a little bit more Black Rose if you hit like, you know, LeBlanc and you're not really hitting like Malzahar, Jace. You just play LeBlanc, Heimer plus 6 Visionaries and put Visionary in LeBlanc. It's totally fine. And so it's a very versatile composition. The thing about this comp, though, is that it feels like it struggles with frontline just as much as Sorcerers do. So you can be kind of vulnerable. It's not like Nunu and Rel are good tanks in the middle of stage 4. They are okay. So you do have to be concerned about that. That's why certain augments like Void Caller or Void Swarm can be really good for the composition to give you a little bit extra frontline. Because 6 Visionary is good. Don't get me wrong. It's going to be hard, especially if Elise is very contested. Like, this is one of the most contested units in the game. Maybe one of the most contested 4 costs ever to exist. She's just extremely important in a lot of compositions. So you're going to likely be stuck on Nunu 2, Leona, and Rel for a while. But then even if you play Leona, you don't even have Academy active. Make sure you go for blue buff on Heimerdinger as a priority. If you do end up finding Shojin, you could still just play it. It's that blue buff is noticeably better. And then you actually want to go damage on Heimerdinger, which is in contrast to the other variations of Heimer. If you look at the Academy versions of Heimer, you play like blue buff, Archangels, and Gunblade. But that's because you're playing a Sentinel frontline, which is a lot different than Visionaries. Visionaries want to deal as much upfront damage as possible so it could heal your allies. And so you don't want to have that scaling AP. You want that upfront quick burst AP. I say that, and we have Archangel Staff on Malzahar, but that's just like one example. I think Deathcap might be a little bit better on Malzahar. Maybe I should change that. Get Malzahar 2, get Heimer 2, anomalize both of them. You know, mana stuff is really, really good. Nothing wasted, kill streak, all very, very good. One thing to think about is the new Touch of Frost actually got buffed to 1.5 seconds, and Malzahar is one of the best appliers of it. So just keep an eye out for that. It might actually be really, really good. That's something that Dishop has recommended. The other variation we talked about very briefly was the Chembaron variation. This is a really hard comp to play, so be mindful that if you do end up playing for this, you might take some bot 4s. But if you master it, it's a very fun way, and probably the best way to play Chembaron, honestly, which is you start off at 2-1 Chembaron, you collect things like the Heimerdinger items, and then you fast 8, and you aim for a 200 or 300 cash out, and look for pretty solid items like Shimmer Bloom, Piltoven, Hex Armor, and you just roll for Ready 3 on 8s while looking for Heimer, and you stabilize through this. This is a variation that actually doesn't even really want Visionary Emblem nearly as badly because it's pretty tight. You have to play Rennie, which means you kind of want to play Singed and Rel as a Sentinel tie-in, which means you don't really have many Visionary +1 spots. You would cut, Morgana to play another good unit, but it's not like as important as it is to focus on the Chembaron cash out stuff. But Visionary Emblem +1 is still very good. All right, they buffed Academy Heimer, and that's very similar to how we used to play it, except I guess the difference is that Rebel is a little bit better now. They did buff the Rebels from 12 to 15, so you do have a little bit more options there. Another fun thing about Academy is that you actually have more access to Corki now that Scrap is less popular. And then also, this is a composition that can play Zoe. You can play Heimer, Ezreal, Zoe, Lux in your back line before you hit Jace. Maybe you don't have quirky items, and you get to grief all the sorcerer players. So it's a composition that's very item versatile. There's not really many bad augments for the composition. There's also not that many insane augments for the composition. It's just very good, safe composition to play. But you do have to make sure that your setup is good for it. Hold all the Sentinels. And this is usually something that you pivot to if you perhaps are looking at a reroll Renata, a reroll Sentinel line, and you realize that it's all contested. Heimer's open. You can just play some Academy and then go to level 8 and just roll on 8 for all this board. If you do get Academy Emblem put on Rumble, Academy actually counts as an Academy sponsored item, which means that Rumble gets a bunch of HP and damage amp. You could also put the Academy Emblem on other units like Corki, maybe a 6 cost. You know, Academy Warwick sounds insane, for example. But other than that, it's pretty basic and straightforward. Just play a 4 Sentinel core with Academy for a while and then eventually get to Jace. Pretty much the same thing as before, just that Heimer got better. Enforcers are still a really strong composition. They kind of buffed Caitlyn. She had like some bug fix that actually helps her DPS a lot, and then they took a little bit of AD away, but consistency with your ability is way more important than 2 AD. So Caitlyn is really filthy. It's still very much oriented around Vi to stabilize. You try to hit Vi on stage 4. If you're on Vi 1 and you have Caitlyn, you still might lose a lot of fights. You just really need to make sure that you are healthy, you are rich, and you're able to hit things like the Vi 2. Try to play around Twisted Fate early game as well. He's a really good item holder for AP items, and that'll be like the way that you get to level 8 with a lot of HP. A lot of people make items for Caitlyn on Natty. They put like IE, Deathblade, and unless you're like really far ahead, that ends up not being that strong, and then you kind of bleed out a lot. Twisted Fate is much more reliable, so don't be afraid to slam things like Morello and Deathcap and then flex until you find Twisted Fate. One of the main innovations is we found out that there's actually some really insane anomalies onto Caitlyn. Call the Weak, for example, is basically like adding an Infinity Edge onto Caitlyn. And so it's very, very good on her in particular. But if you do have Infinity Edge already, it's not as good. So just keep that in mind. It's basically like a missing IE on Caitlyn, and it's quite powerful. The other is Wolf Familiars, because you have so much DPS, and Wolf Familiars ends up being quite good on something like Caitlyn. So those are just a couple of things to keep in mind. You also could just anomalize Vi. It's very common with the usual tanky stuff, maybe Infectious Anomaly. All those are pretty good. They also buffed 6 Enforcers, so you don't actually need the Enforcer emblem. And if you don't have the Enforcer emblem, just drop someone like Camille and just flex in other units that are really good. Elise, for example, or maybe a 6 cost. Maybe you hit a Savika instead, so you can play Savika and Vi. There's a lot of different things you could do. Don't feel like you need the Enforcer emblem to play Enforcer. In fact, I actually think the Enforcer crest itself, especially on 2-1, is a little bit overrated because you really want the econ and you really want like the tempo. And so if you take like an Enforcer crest on 2-1, pretty decent chance that you don't like win streak the stage, and then you're really poor. And then if you're poor, can't hit by 2, you're going to lose a lot of stage 4. So those are all like different kinds of things to think about when you're playing for Enforcers. Play it for the Vi and Twisted Fate items, and then eventually late game make those Caitlyn items. Scrap is definitely worse this patch, but it's still solid for LP if you know the spots for it. Scrap also happens to be one of the few compositions that you can lose streak and play for as a 4-2 bailout. And that's because of 2 things. The first is that Scrap actually can capitalize on loose streak augments, like what doesn't kill you, and really scale well with it. Not only do you get a bunch of gold, but a lot of items. And as you know, more items make Scraps more powerful. So that's like one example. The other is that there's no composition that stabilizes quite like hitting Rumble on 4-2. So if you do get to level 8 and you hit an early Rumble, your board like doubles in power because of how much burst you're able to do. And so even if you have Echo and Corki 1, that Rumble is still really good. A couple of things have changed with itemization on Scrap since we last maybe talked about it. The first is that you guys probably already know, but the belt ends up converting into a guard breaker guaranteed. So if you ever put an Infinity Edge on Corki or an Infinity Edge on Gangplank, you definitely want that belt. But there's a couple of other small things as well. So for example, a chain vest always turns into a crown guard on the Powder and Rumble and Echo. And apparently, Crown Guard through a scrapped item is currently bugged to give more AP than usual. But it has to have this shield expire first. There's something about like Crown Guard, and when the shield expires against 25 AP, apparently that doubles on scrap. But you can't be building the Crown Guard itself onto the unit. It doesn't actually get the double AP. It's only if you put a vest onto those. I don't believe Riot said that that's like a serious like exploit or whatever, and you're gonna get banned. You know, maybe it's even unethical to share that with people. But I feel like if everyone's on equal footing, it's a slightly more powerful interaction. It's not like Crown Guard's actually even good on Scrap, by the way. Like you don't really actually want Crown Guard on Echo because you have so much shield already through Scrap. So it's not like super game breaking. I think it, like, if anything, you look at the data, it's just like marginally better. Not anything super significant. The whole point of me sharing that is we found some optimizations for that. So just want to let people know so that way everyone is on equal ground. The usual augments are still really good. Powered shields, trait tracker. I do think they nerfed the movable object to 50%, so it's less good, but you still take it for the most part. And then the last thing is there are some people in Asia Pacific in the SEA server in particular that actually prioritize Gangplank 3, and that's what happens when you're stuck on level 8 and rolling to 0 and you can't get to 9. So if you're on 8, don't sell those extra Gangplanks. Try to play for Gangplank 3. Put a third item for him instead and go, red buff, IE, plus these giant spell for Guard Breaker. And try to prioritize Gangplank 3 carry, because that might be one of your outs in case you can't find a way to push a 9. As we talked about earlier in the video, Rebels got buffed with their HP, and so now they are way more stable. It's really funny how 3% HP buff ends up making such a profound difference for this composition. But now, all of a sudden, Alawi 1 with upgraded 1 and 2 costs feels a lot less fraudulent, and you're able to actually stabilize if you hit Zoe 2, 1-star Jinx, and 1-star Alawi. You actually can sometimes stop rolling and push to level 9. Ultimately, though, this composition is still a Jinx composition to cap out, so you still want to play for like a fast 9 playstyle. Take things like level up, upworld ability. Birthday present's actually really good. I need to add birthday present into this augment selection, but there's a lot of different econ augments that help you get to 9 and play for a Rebel win out. You do want to play from high tempo though, because Rebel is not really that reliable if you're loose streaking, because that means you have to hit Jinx, and even then Jinx 1 still can miss. She can also get blown up by backline access, like an ambusher assassin, for example. But it's still really good. And the nice thing too is that you can open up angling for visionaries. You can play like Vex, Rel, Renata, slam these items, and then realize that your spot is better for Rebels and kind of pivot into Rebels. So that's part of why Visionary is just such a good composition. Just like taking a step back out of compositions and looking at macro, is that if you angle for something like this, you actually can deviate into a level 8 Visionary tempo board if you find yourself contested, or you find like a really good reason to pivot, like an early Heimer. Or you can find yourself going into Rebels because it all kind of links together very intricately through like the Vex and the Sentinel opener. So big thumbs up for AP this patch. Quick Striker Reroll has 2 variations. The one you've probably heard us talk about ad nauseum at this point. Nocturne with range is good. Thumbs up. Not really much to say. Get range, spin to win, AFK, blend. Make sure you slam damage items on Nocturne, Infinity Edge, Giant Slayer, tempo really hard, and then fall off late game, secure your top 2, top 3, top 4. Not too much more to add in terms of the composition itself, but in terms of the augments, they did nerf Prismatic Pipeline and Exalted Adventure, so it's worse. But too much value is still really broken. So if you see too much value, you're often thinking about something like Quick Strikers. The other thing is that you can also play the Loris and Twisted Fate variation, and this composition is also really good, but it's extremely expensive because you're not only looking for TF3 and Loris 3, which already doubled 3-cost reroll is very expensive. Think Kog'Maw and Scar, and how you really need something like Gambler's Blade to snowball that. But also you really want a duo carry, so you kind of want like an Akali 3. Maybe this is where you also play melee Nocturne. If you get AD items for Nocturne but no range, you can always just deviate to a Twisted Fate carry with Nocturne AD. So this is the composition you think about. Also, they did buff Trifecta, so Trifecta is a lot better for this composition. So make sure you take a chance at that and see how good it could be. But I personally think this reroll comp is quite solid. One distinction to make about Twisted Fate as a primary carry is that if he's a duo, he can hold utility like Shiv and Morello. I think in this variation, we have Morello on him. We do. And you can also put like Shiv or whatever, like doesn't really matter. But if you do make Twisted Fate your primary carry, you want to make sure that he has a lot of AP. It's partially why Infectious Anomaly is really good, because Infectious Anomaly gives Twisted Fate so much stats, and then you stack all your Quick Strikers. They do a bunch of stats and damage, so make sure you itemize correctly and don't just go like utility only on Twisted Fate. Ambushers. Ambushers. This composition got nerfed. Echo is worse now. But ambushers are still strong, especially when you get to a high roll Smeech spot. I think the angle to play this is pretty much when you have Smeech dropped early, or you have like a very strong likelihood of hitting Camille 2 with a strong item. Something like a Silvermere Dawn or Prowler's Claw is really good. You could put Prowler's Claw on Camille and put it later on Smeech. Or maybe something like a Loot Explosion, Ambusher Crown type start. I don't think this is something that you angle for if you have a generic opener. Let's say you open up Raining Gold and then you have like Camille with Powder and you have a Hand of Justice. I think that's much closer to Enforcers than it is in Ambushers, mainly because you are unlikely to actually be able to win streak on stage 2 and 3, and you're going to be struggling to keep up with the rest of the lobby if you lose too much HP early game, and you really want to have that Smeech, because Smeech is actually quite good in the early game to kill units, and without it, you're going to be losing a lot of HP. Ambusher is still really good on Rumble, and if you can get to Rumble Jinx, it's great, but many times you're going to be playing cheaper variations of it. So instead of Rumble, you're going to be playing another Sentinel. Instead of Jinx, you're going to be playing Powder. If you don't have the Ambusher emblem, you're going to be playing 4 Ambushers for quite some time. Make sure you roll on 7. Smeech wants double healing and Titans. If you do have a lot of Omnivamp through, say, the Anomaly, as well as your Augments, then you can go for double Titans. I've seen that. It worked okay. And Infectious Anomaly is still really good in this composition, as well as other ways to give Smeech extra life. Zeri Sentinels are back. It is a build that China has popularized, and it's kind of counterintuitive because people think, oh, wait, no Firelight Zeri? Is that even good? But yeah, it turns out that Firelight griefs Zeri's positioning a lot of times. She ends up like flying to the other side of the board, and then that's like she jumps over to Maddie, and then it turns out Elise is over here. Elise dies to the biggest clump of enemies. Zeri swoops into there. It's just very inconsistent, and she also incidentally might target the wrong units. The other element of it is that Double Rage Blade Gunblade is back. This is the build that we played for like Callista, if you guys remember Callista Fairy from the last set. Double Rage Blade with an infinite frontline stacking, and then Singe ended up giving the attack speed back to Zeri, so that helps her get that really good feedback loop of healing the enemy over and over. Sentinel Zeri, very, very good. Play off of it from a Starry Night opener, or if you have the ability to go for Rage Blades, plural, very easily, like a component anvil. That's partially why we have Pandora's, by the way, because it just feels like you really need to have those items. You need 3 rods. Unlike Renata, though, it's not about Rel, it's about Singe, so make sure you prioritize Singe. I would actually also choose to anomalize Singe if I have to, but for the most part, you really want Zeri ones. Mini-Me is the best. Strength Training is also acceptable. There's a handful of others that you can pick. And if you do have to anomalize frontline, you just go for Singed, but you're pretty much going to always go for Zeri because you need the DPS. The composition is really good at stalling. You have so much frontline, but you don't really have much backline going on, so make sure you get that Zeri zapping away and anomalize her as well. And I remember the last thing I want to talk about is that people actually question whether or not you roll on 5 or 6 with Zeri. With Sentinels in particular, you roll on 5 for Sentinel Zeri. If you're rolling for Watcher Zeri, you actually roll on 6 and 7 because you need access to Scar and the 4 costs. And that's yet another reason why people really like Sentinel Zeri, because you can roll quicker and get online faster and stabilize, and your top end feels comparable to the 4 Firelight Zeri. So people just prefer this variation, and it's much quicker. All right, let's talk about some of the other compositions on the tier list that aren't in the A tier that you'll be seeing every game. The first is Urgot Reroll, and this composition is still pretty strong, but you pretty much have to have like the Urgot spot, like Unleash the Beast, a Horrible Forge with an artifact for Urgot. This is not something that you can basically reroll anymore without any of those setups, because if you do, you're pretty much just playing for like a 4th or a 5th. It's just much weaker now because they nerfed Urgot repeatedly. So it's a pretty big deal. The nice thing about Urgot is that I think it's less dependent on an econ reroll because you pretty much just need Urgot 3. Many other of these compositions that reroll, like Renata, Nocturne, Zeri, they kind of rely on several 3-star units. And so they want things like Starry Night and too much value and whatnot. And you still could do that here for Urgot, but it's not that important to hit just on a 3. You just really want Urgot 3 and then to push levels. And the cool thing is, if everyone else is rerolling, they're pulling units out of the pool for you because no one's playing Urgot outside of Urgot Reroll. So keep an eye out for that. I do think it's a good composition, but you pretty much need to have these augments and items. Otherwise, you're going to have a rough time, I think, in the mid and late game. Speaking of Tristana, I think Tristana Reroll has gotten a lot better since they buffed Emissaries, and that just improves her front line. This is the Emissary Watcher variation, which is, I think, the highest cap board of Tristana. But more commonly, you're going to be seeing Sentinel Tristana because it's just, again, very similar to Zeri. It's just like the easier and faster version that gets online quicker because it's less expensive, and therefore you're likely to preserve more HP and win fights. And with Tristana, the more fights you win, the more you're able to snowball and stack that permanent AD on her. And so you're probably going to be playing Sentinel Tristana like 80 to 90% of your games, but this version is technically stronger. I guess maybe we should feature Sentinel Tristana because it's just more consistent, and we'll probably put this one a little bit further back. One example when you play Emissary Tristana is Caretaker's Ally or Worth the Wait. You just get that unit and you're basically guaranteed hitting it with leveling. Another could be that Sentinels are contested, right? Like you can try to play the Sentinel version, which is more consistent, but 1, 2, 3 compositions in the lobby might be contesting you with Zeri, Renata, and Nocturne. So if they're holding the Sentinels, you're going to be in for a bad time. So just make sure that you're not overly tunneled on that. Dominators got buffed, and it is better now. I do think you can play it. It's sort of a high roll AP comp that you play when you realize that sorcerers are way too contested and visionaries are not really possible, maybe because you just don't have good visionary items. Like you have like Shojin Nashers and you're like, ugh, these are like bad visionary items. So you're thinking about Dominators instead. And the most important thing about this composition is that it capitalizes on a tempo window in stage 4 by hitting things like Mundo and Silco because they're uncontested units and be able to get to level 9. The key to this composition is being uncontested. Do not opt into it contested because the whole advantage is that you hit Silco and Mundo quickly and you can go to 9 to look for Mordekaiser. While everyone else is fighting over LeBlanc, Garen, Elise, so on and so forth, you get to just opt out of that. Even though we do have Elise here, there's just like an optional thing. You get to opt out of that and go straight to 9. Make sure you have one good econ augment and one good combat augment that complements Dominators very, very well, like Mana Flow or Clockwork Accelerator. A couple other Dominator rerolls I also want to shout out while we have an opportunity. This is a newer composition now that they buff Cassio, but Cassio Blitz reroll is sort of a thing. I think the main condition for this is if you have Unending Despair because it is very good on Blitzcrank. And so you're looking for like Blitzcrank 3, Cassio 3, you roll on 7 and you play 6 Dominators that way, and you have Blitzcrank primary tank. I think the stats on it look pretty good, but there's very little data on it, so kind of hard to make out. But yeah, Cassio technically got better, and this is, I guess, another thing you could think about. Let's say you slam blue buff, you're looking for Visionaries and Heimerdinger. Holy cow, there's 3 Visionary players. What do I do? Play Cassio, I guess, and maybe get a top 4 and get out. And you know what? Top 4 is good. If you are in a 3 or 4-way contested scenario and you're realizing that you can't play any of the A tier comps, play some of these B and C tier comps to get your top 4 and preserve that LP, because that's going to be the key to climbing. And we do want to shout out that you could also play Dominator, Mana Zane Ziggs. It's a lot less consistent because this composition kind of struggles with the fact that Dominators are unlocked at level 7 and 8, but you want to play around 2 cost. And so when you reroll for Ziggs on 6, you're not hitting Silco, you're not hitting Mundo. It's going to be really hard to get the board together, but that is something to think about if you have Mana Zane and Ziggs. So yeah, Dominators overall have several game plans, even other situational augments like, you know, the daddy-daughter menace with Silco and Powder. You could also just play Fast 9 AP as well. Those are all different possible things that you can explore. Twitch is very inconsistent. Do not play Twitch if you are ever even remotely behind. I think it's purely a win streak composition and you have like really good Twitch items. I think that Experiment Emblem got nerfed pretty hard, so it's not even as good as it was before. And so yeah, I just don't think this composition is very consistent anymore. I do think that there's a couple of things that might signal a Twitch game. If you have Rageblade and you have something like Golemify or Dumbify, that's usually pretty good for Twitch. And I also do think that sometimes you just have like an IE gold collector start and scrap is just not possible. You're looking around and it's just, you can't play Quirky. So just slam that Rageblade, look to Twitch, and play instead for the experiment board. But I think that unless you're capping out with Warwick, you're just generally going to be aiming for a top 4, and that just feels bad for a composition. So try to avoid Twitch if you can. You could play the Bruiser variation of Twitch, but I think they nerfed this interaction specifically, so it's a lot less consistent. So yeah, I would probably just stay away from it overall. A couple of quick rapid fire ones as well. Chem Baron is pretty hard to play. I would say that the Chem Baron rework has been a failure, and I think that they would have to readdress Chem Baron again, because right now the only way you want to play Chem Baron is for cash outs for rerolls like 100, 200. So I would stay away from Chem Baron. In fact, this probably goes towards the bottom of the tier list by the end of the patch, because right now I just do not think it's very good. So just stay away from it until further notice. Family reroll is actually making a little bit of a comeback as well. If you have superstars and anger issues, these are like really good augments that help Violet a lot. And they did buff Pit Fighter, so for the most part, I think it's still kind of weak. I just think that it's very augment dependent. So unless I have superstars or a family to start off with, I'm not looking to play as calm. And finally, I do think Kog'Maw actually does have a place in the metagame, usually through artifacts or to play through tempo. But I think you have to have Kog'Maw at the very beginning, and you have to be taking like some of these artifacts or other things that justify you leaning into it, because it's a heavy tempo top 4 into comp, and it can do well, but not looking to play it unless I have one of these artifacts that really make Cog shine. Let's talk about some of the hero augments real quick. Glazov Vander. This augment might actually be up there as an S tier augment. It's actually really good. It has a lot of burst. Vander is extremely tanky, and if you build him correctly with Infinity Edge, Hodge, and Bloodthirster, like double healing plus Infinity Edge, he is quite a menace. Build Vertical Watchers. You don't have to roll for Violet 3 and Powder 3. Those are optional, but you do really want to get the Watchers. And of course, 4 Family is really good on him. The reason why I don't think it is S tier though is that there's a couple of like hard counters to Vander. The first is that Vander is positioned in the center because when he has gloves off the augment, he knocks that unit into the back line and deal AoE, meaning that you could position around it, and Vander is easily not actually that effective if he's not actually getting a bunch of AoE. He's going to struggle to kill things, and then you just kind of gang up on him. The second is that this knockback is actually immune to things like deep roots. So if you're going up against Vander and you get offered deep roots as an anomaly, this Vander's not going to do actually very much because he can't actually knock it back. So there's a couple of small things that hard counter Vander, but he's still really good. So definitely do not sleep on this hero augment. I have a game of Vander hero augment that I show you why exactly it's insane. I think it was a really good comeback into a strong first. So check it out if you haven't already. Hero augment number 2, we have Crimson Pack Vlad. This hero augment is quite powerful as well because they buff sorcerers and they buff emissaries, and that ends up being really good for Vlad, who's a watcher sorcerer. And it caps enormously high because LeBlanc is amazing, and you have a lot of different ways that you can make your level 9 and 10 super good. The downside of it is, well, if there's 2 to 3 sorcerer players, I mean, good luck hitting Crimson Pack Vlad. I've been in games where I had heroic grab bag and I was stuck on 6 Vlads. I couldn't even find the 7th Vlad. So it's very competitive. I would scout very diligently to make sure that there's at most 1 or 2 sorcerer players and try to go for the Vlad 3. As you can see, we even have like both of the duplicator augments because it's very important. Make sure you have Rageblade and Archangels on Vlad. The third item is a healing item. You don't have to go for Gunblade all the time. You can go for a Bloodthirster if you absolutely need to, because it's just hard to get 3 rods at times. But also, Wit's End does basically that as well. So Wit's End ends up being the replacement to the Gunblade if you do end up getting it. For the anomaly on Vlad, there is this new one called Cultivating Magic, which is you get 30 ability power, and every time you deal 10,000, you get more. It's been sort of impressive every time we've seen it, so give it a try. Still not 100% sold that it might be the best one, but something to think about. The other could be also that you could play him like the old school Lux, double Archangels with the Vladimir and just watch him scale. So this is kind of like Lone Hero Vlad in some ways, but your mileage may vary. Just keep that in mind. Irelia's hero augment is also very impressive, mainly because they buffed 7 rebels. So now Irelia is even tankier and healthier. So this is pretty straightforward. Not really too many comments other than the fact that make sure you build IE on her. And sometimes IE is the first item on Academy. So what you can do in the early game is play Irelia, Lux, Ezreal, and Leona, and then play like Academy Irelia with rebels. then put the Infinity Edge on her to complete the item. So that's just like one pro tip. But other than that, pretty straightforward 1-cost reroll. Roll above 50 gold at 3-1, and then try to hit every 3 as fast as you can and push levels for 7 Rebel. All right, last composition I want to talk about, build different. This composition is a lot better now because you can actually play a mixture of AD and AP pretty reliably. Very start of the set, it felt like you could only play AD with it because those were the only viable units. But now that they rebuffed Malzahar, LeBlanc is a menace, Jace is good, 6 costs are splashable, and they just buffed a bunch of low-cost units in general. Your path to get to level 8 is a lot easier now. In fact, it's just pretty much just going to be always the thing about build different. The more balanced the set is, the better build different gets because you just have more options. The thing about build different is you have to make sure that you have enough econ and items to justify it, because the problem is sometimes you have Alawi 2, Vi 2, Corki 2, Twitch 2, and you only have 6 items that you can make, and you can't really have them all hold stuff, so it feels really bad. So just make sure to play around whoever is upgraded. That is the key. Itemize the upgrades. Mordekaiser are still the best 5 cost that you can play around if possible, but otherwise, just flex, have fun. I honestly think I would click it every time if I could, because I think it's super fun to play build different and have fun. All right, that's a ton of information. Hopefully got all that. If there's anything that you take away, though, the important thing to remember is that you can play a ton of things in the meta game, but you definitely need to have the opener for it. And like we said at the beginning of the video, try to pick a reroll line first. If you are contested or you see a better opportunity because you're high rolling, or you see like an augment that's perfect for a 4-cost comp, then you can choose to pivot into it. Just try to be very consistent and climb that way, and you'll find yourself having way more LP because you're not going 7-8 and trying to play for 4 costs and getting punished by the rerollers. We're almost done with set 13, by the way. I think we only have one more major patch left, maybe one big shift in the tier list. But other than that, this is what's going to look like for the rest of the set. Pretty balanced. So hope you guys enjoy it. Good luck on the climb, and I'll see you guys next time.